Now let's take a minute to talk about rates. This is always a tricky subject, especially more so when you don't know the lay of the land, you don't know the current market value for your skills, you don't know where you stand in the process. But soon enough, you go through this a few times and you'll quickly learn how to identify when to discuss rates, who to discuss rates with, what the normal is. And you should be reaching out to those people around you early on, figuring out where you, specifically on a project by project basis, because you're freelance and you work on a project by project basis, you're going to have to do this time and time again. And although it would be really nice to have an agent do it for you, until you get to that point, you're going to have to know and focus on these skills and focus on what the information that you need in order to make an educated approach to dealing with rates. You're going to have to know this stuff and work on it. So let's chat about what the rate situation looks like on a project when it gets discussed and the easiest ways to deal with it when it comes up. So before we get into it, let's just understand together what's happening at the production company at this time. Like I say, this is probably, if the job's been awarded, this is probably the single busiest point in the office for administrative tasks. They got to book lots of crew, they got to book talent, they got to book locations. It is just chaos in there. More often than not, again, depending on the size of the production company, they are doing this with multiple cinematographers. So they are getting rates from multiple cinematographers. It's not just you. So you're not just out there able to dictate whatever rates you want. You will be measured against other people around you. Now, if you have a director or producer that will go out on a limb for you, you might be able to get away with more and you won't get as much pushback, but it's not uncommon to get pushback on rates. It's not uncommon for people to ask for deals. So just be aware of that going into it and you should be all right. Now, if we're talking about before the job is awarded, more often than not, they'll be asking for quotes, okay? Already you have a foot in the door because they're talking to you about it before the job gets awarded, before they've fully treated and fully sent in their pitch. So that's good. They'll be asking for quotes. You can send those in. It's an entirely different process, but quotes is different from rates, which is what we're talking about here. Now, there are generally 3 different ways that this goes down. And again, just understand that I say generally because it's going to be different every single time, but they can basically fit inside these 3 segments. And number 1, the producer is going to reach out in an email or in a telephone conversation and say, hey, this is what we have for the project. What do you think? Or is this acceptable? Or are you happy to go ahead? This is the rates. Now, that could happen in the initial contact if it's with the producer or the production manager. That could happen then. Or it could happen much later. It could happen the last week of pre. It could happen whenever. Just know that this is coming. This conversation could be coming. And they will say, this is what we have. Is that acceptable? Now, you can choose to say yes or no. You can choose to fire back with some sort of counteroffer. You just have to judge it for yourself. The other way that will happen is they'll ask for a quote. So they'll ask you to send through based on pre-production days, travel days, and actual shoot days. Again, depending on if it's international or a big travel job, there will be some leeway. The third option is that they'll never bring up anything, and you'll have to bring it up, right? Which is definitely the worst, the most awkward, and probably the biggest red flag, not only for that pre-production process, but for the production in general, because how a producer organizes pre-production will basically show you how they're going to organize the shoot, and a disorganized shoot could be a complete clusterfuck and something that you don't want to be involved in. So be aware that these red flags, you should be looking for them and spotting them. If nobody brings up rates, that's probably a good sign that you're in trouble and you're in deep water with people that don't know how to swim. The best of those 3 scenarios by far is number 1, where the producer reaches out and says, this is what we have. Because then you have an understanding, you might be leveling up, you might be working in a brand new area that you haven't before, and you think, well, these are the rates that I'm accustomed to. If they reach out and say this is what they're offering and it's significantly more, well, happy days, right? Even if it's significantly less, already better because you know the ballpark, you know where they're coming from. And then you can negotiate based off of that, right? But the more information that comes to you, the more power that you have. The power to accept, the power to renegotiate, the power to say no. It was really scenario number 1 is where you want to be living, right? The quoting one I don't like as much. That's the second option. I don't like as much. Number 1, it takes a lot of time if you're doing lots of quotes. Say it turns into a busy period and you've got 3 or 4 jobs on. You're having to send out quotes and you don't know if they want gear or travel days or whatever it is. And then judging your own rates of how you do travel days versus how you do pre-production days versus shoot days, and whether you do a buyout or whether you do overtime, which here in Australia, there is, at least never that I've heard of, a cinematographer that does overtime. completely different subject. But most cinematographers here work on a buyout schedule, which then has to factor into your rates, right? It has to factor in the way that you price your services. It comes back to how you're going to break it down on an hourly basis, whether or not you're going to offer deals or anything like that. So this rates conversation is not easy. So the more information you have, the better the chance that you're going to come off of winning in a scenario that you're happy with and you still get the job. One thing to think about here is that if it is a longer job, more often than not, the producer is going to know that they can leverage that against you. So if it's a 10-day job, but you're only shooting for 5 because the other 5 are travel, there is room for negotiation in there. There's lots of points where you can give in. If you really want to do something, you can say, there's lots of different ways you can tackle it. We'll get into the actual talks in the next module, but just know that there are different times when you're going to be leveraged one way or the other. Sometimes you're going to have the upper hand. Sometimes the production company is going to have the upper hand. It's really taking into a whole host of factors, how much you want to work with that person, investing in the future. If you're taking a pay cut this time to do a job with the director or production company, you should take that into account and understand that it's not always just about the money. When you are talking about rates, there's going to be 3 outcomes, right? There's going to be you're happy with what they send through, and they're happy with you on the job. You're going to send through a quote. That's the first one. The second one is you're going to send through a quote, and they're not happy. They ask for some deal or something, then you can choose to accept or deny, or you can again go back and renegotiate, but there's that negotiation process. Or finally, you're just never going to hear from them, which is really probably more often than not what's going to happen. Even if they reach out and say you're available for these dates, then they check rates, or they check something else, or the initial cinematographer that they really wanted is available, so now they don't need you, but they've been in contact with you, so you send back that information, and then you never hear from them. So just expect that, know that that's a possibility. The big takeaway from this section is just trying to put yourself in the best situation to succeed. Right? You need as much information as you can get. You want to be as upfront with the production as you can be, because it's that fine line between negotiating what you're worth, not getting taken advantage of, but also showing that you really want to be involved in the project and maintaining that good cop, bad cop relationship with the production company, which is why it's so hard before you have an agent to say, man, I really want to do this job, really want to do it. I'm excited about it. I like the director, I like the producer, I like all these things that are involved. I think it can be really fantastic, but also I don't want to get screwed, right? And I know my worth, I know my rate, I know how much I should be getting, I know how much is fair. And sometimes that can be really murky waters to manage that successfully. It gets easier with an agent when the agent can go in and be the bad person and say, well, this is unacceptable, or these travel days are unacceptable, or it has to be business class, or whatever it is. It's a little bit harder to nitpick when you're on your own. But just understand that it's going to be a delicate process. And sometimes, for sure, you're going to fuck this up. For sure, there are going to be issues. And you're going to lose jobs because of this. I know I have. I know I've overcooked it. I know I've asked for things that were probably unrealistic at the time. But I was just trying to push it, trying to see how far you could get. Or the flip side of that is, if it's busy, people always ask about rates. And we'll talk about this in the next module. But maybe, just maybe, you use that busy period to inflict a smaller schedule by saying, well, I'll do the project, but for this amount or for that amount. And you just raise your rates incrementally as you get busier, saying, if you want the services, this is what it's going to cost. The next group comes in, you got to raise it and raise it and raise it. And then that's how you bump up your rates naturally. Just know there's probably a cap depending on your area where people will find it acceptable. And if you take advantage of people in the busy times, be sure that will come back to you eventually, because it's a long process we're talking about. It's a career. It's not just a few years of getting started that you should be worried about. Okay, that's our look here. Let's get into the next section, talking about negotiating those rates.